It is February 9th, 1943. Over the frigid, steel-gray waters of the Barents Sea, a lone, crippled giant struggles for altitude. The four massive propeller engines of a United States Army Air Force's B-17F Flying Fortress, Delta Rebel No. 2, scream in protest. Her fuselage is shredded by cannon fire. Her hydraulic system is a gushing ruin, and her right main landing gear dangles uselessly, torn away by the relentless guns of a German fighter. Inside, the 10-man crew battles the biting cold, the stench of cordite and fear, and the terrifying certainty that their aircraft is dying beneath them. With fuel bleeding away and the Arctic cold seeping into their bones, the pilot faces an impossible choice: ditch in the frozen sea and almost certainly perish, or attempt the unthinkable. What happened next would become a legend of sheer airmanship and cold courage under fire. This is the story of how one man, Captain Homer L. Pappy Sanders, was forced to land a 25-ton bomber with no wheels, and the single, unlikely field he chose to use. A story not of a grand battle, but of a single, desperate fight for survival against physics, geography, and time. The mission had begun 24 hours earlier from the windswept Royal Air Force Base at Thurles, England. The bomber, Delta Rebel No. 2, serial number 41 to 24,520, was assigned to the 367th Bomb Squadron of the 306th Bomb Group, part of the mighty 8th Air Force. Their target was the strategic German naval base at Trondheim, Norway, a vital hub for U-boat operations threatening the Arctic convoy supplying the Soviet Union. It was a long, punishing flight over hostile waters. At the controls was 25-year-old Captain Homer Sanders, a calm and capable pilot from Tyler, Texas. His crew, a mix of seasoned veterans and newer men, included co-pilot Second Lieutenant William Bill Funderburg, navigator Second Lieutenant William Mack McAfee, and a tight-knit group of enlisted gunners and engineers led by Technical Sergeant John Jock Parrish, the top turret gunner and flight engineer. The aircraft itself was a fortress of aluminum and steel, a symbol of American industrial might, carrying a full load of 500-pound bombs and thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The plan was to join a larger formation, but cloud cover and navigational difficulties saw Delta Rebel No. 2 and a handful of other B-17s from the 306th proceeding largely alone, a fact that would have dire consequences. As they approached the Norwegian coast, the weather cleared treacherously, revealing a beautiful, deadly sky. The Luftwaffe was waiting, a mixed force of Messerschmitt Bf-109S and the heavier, more heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190s, based at nearby airfields, vectored in to intercept the vulnerable formation. The American gunners manned their positions, their breath fogging in the sub-zero air, their eyes scanning the vast, empty blue for the first specks of enemy fighters. The stage was set for a running battle that would stretch from the coast of Norway all the way back to the distant, unseen shores of neutral Sweden. The first attack came just after bombs away. A swarm of FW-190s, their distinctive radial engines gleaming, dove from the sun. Tracers laced the sky. Inside Delta Rebel No. 2, the world dissolved into a cacophony of noise. The deafening hammer of the .50 calibers, the sharp bang, bang, bang of 20mm cannon shells striking home, the roar of the engines, and the intercom chatter of desperate men. Cannon fire ripped into the right wing, severing fuel lines. Another shell exploded near the tail, wounding the waist gunners. But the most critical blow was yet to come. A well-aimed burst from Bf-109 attacking from low and behind slammed into the right side of the fuselage and the wing root. The hydraulic lines, concentrated in that area, were shredded. Fluid, vital for operating the landing gear, flaps, and brakes, sprayed into the slipstream. Almost simultaneously, a 20mm shell struck the right main landing gear assembly itself. With a sickening crunch of tearing metal, the entire wheel and strut were sheared clean away, leaving a gaping, jagged hole. In the cockpit, warning lights blazed. The hydraulic pressure gauge plummeted to zero. Captain Sanders and Lieutenant Funderburg felt the aircraft yaw violently to the right, fighting to maintain control. "We've lost the right gear. Hydraulics are gone." Sanders shouted over the interphone. The crippled fortress, now losing fuel and trailing smoke, began to lag behind the dwindling formation. For the next 2 hours, the crew fought a continuous, draining battle. The German fighters, like wolves sensing weakness, pressed their attacks. The gunners, despite wounds and frozen guns, fought back with grim determination. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Lawrence Larry Benson, suspended in his plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, raked a passing FW-190, seeing it spin away trailing smoke. But the damage was done. By 1300 hours, they were alone over the sea, the German fighters having broken off, low on fuel and ammunition. The immediate threat of destruction had passed, but a more insidious enemy now took his place. Distance, damage, and dwindling options. A cold calculus took over in the cockpit. Navigator M, CFE plotted their position. They were hundreds of miles from their base in England, with a damaged aircraft that could not possibly make the return journey across the North Sea. To the west lay the open ocean, and almost certain death in the freezing water. To the east lay Nazi-occupied Norway. To the south was the faint, fragile hope of neutral Sweden. Internment in a Swedish camp was a far better prospect than capture by the Germans or a watery grave. Sanders made the decision. They would try for Sweden. But to get there, they had to cross the mountainous spine of Norway. On 3 engines, with a massive drag from the wrecked landing gear, the B-17 struggled for altitude, its crew throwing every non-essential item overboard. Ammunition, flak jackets, even the damaged ball turret was jettisoned to save weight. The aircraft crept upwards, the jagged, snow-covered peaks of the Norwegian coast seeming to reach up for them. For an agonizing hour, they inched over the mountains, the pilots nursing the straining engines, every man aboard holding his breath. Finally, they crossed into Swedish airspace. Relief was momentary, replaced by a new, more technical terror. They were safe from the Germans, but they still had to land a 25-ton aircraft with no landing gear and no brakes. MCFE, studying his maps, identified a potential haven, a small, frozen lake marked near the town of Arvidsjaur in Swedish Lapland, deep within the Arctic Circle. It was remote, it was frozen, and it was flat. It was their only chance. Sanders, his hand steady on the controls, acknowledged the plan. They would attempt a belly landing on the ice. But as they descended through the overcast, a new problem revealed itself. The lake, Lake Gusjon, was not a smooth sheet of ice. It was covered in deep, drifted snow. Landing on it would be like hitting a plowed field. The nose would dig in and the aircraft would somersault, killing them all. The tension in the cockpit, which had briefly eased, now returned with a suffocating weight. They had survived fighters in mountains only to be defeated by snow. With fuel gauges hovering near empty and the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control, Sanders made a desperate, circling search. And then, he saw it. Not on the lake, but beside it. A narrow, flat strip of land, cleared of snow. It was a pasture. A farmer's field, nestled between the frozen lake and a dense pine forest. It was impossibly short for a B-17. But it was their only option. "We're putting her down in that field," Sanders said, his voice calm but final. The crew braced for impact. The crisis was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying ballet with death. There was no sudden explosion, no violent maneuver, just the agonizing procedure of preparing for an impact they knew could shatter the aircraft and its occupants. Captain Sanders ordered the crew to assume crash positions. The gunners left their stations, moving to the reinforced areas of the radio room and behind the cockpit bulkhead. They fastened their parachute harnesses to securing points, knowing they would not be bailing out, but hoping the webbing would hold them during the violent deceleration. They stuffed flak helmets and any spare padding between themselves and the hard metal frames of the aircraft. The atmosphere was thick with silent prayer and the smell of sweat and fear. What happened next was a series of violent, shuddering impacts that seemed to last forever. At precisely 15:27 hours local time, the keel of the B-17 struck the frozen Swedish earth. Outside, the Swedish countryside rushed past at 120 miles per hour, a blur of white snow, dark green pines, and the stark gray ice of the lake. Sanders, with Thunderberg assisting, initiated the final approach. He had one pass, one chance. There were no flaps to slow them down. There were no brakes to stop them. There was only the drag of the open bomb bay doors, which he had ordered open to help slow the aircraft and prevent them from scooping up earth and flipping on impact. The field, from this perspective, looked horrifyingly small, a postage stamp surrounded by towering, unyielding trees. The downdraft from the props whipped the snow on the field into a blinding swirl. 500 feet, 400, 300. Thunderbird called out the altitude, his voice tight. The ground rose up to meet them. Sanders pulled back on the throttles, killing the engine power. The roaring scream of the Wright Cyclones faded to a windmilling whine. The only sound was the rush of air over the torn fuselage. At 50 feet, he flared the aircraft, lifting the nose slightly to present the entire length of the belly as a sled. The first contact was a deafening, grinding roar of tortured metal shearing away. The aircraft settled onto its belly, skidding across the field with a force that pinned every man against his restraints. Snow, frozen clods of earth, and shattered pieces of the aircraft were thrown up in a great plume around them. The sound was apocalyptic, a screeching, ripping, tearing cacophony that drowned out all thought. The men were thrown about like rag dolls inside their harnesses, their vision blurred by the vibration. Sparks flew as metal scraped over rock-hard ground. The bomber was acting as a colossal plow, digging a furrow hundreds of feet long through the field. The left wingtip, extending out, caught a low mound of earth and was torn clean off, sending the aircraft into a sickening, lurching slide to the left. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed they would cartwheel. But Sanders, still fighting the controls, even as they dragged on the ground, used the ailerons and the last vestiges of differential engine power from the two left side props to keep the wings level. The forest at the far end of the field rushed towards them at horrifying speed. There was nothing more the pilots could do. The B-17, shedding pieces of itself, finally ground to a shuddering halt. The silence that followed was absolute and profound, broken only by the ping of cooling metal and the moan of the wind through the torn airframe. They had stopped just 60 feet from the tree line. For several seconds, no one moved, stunned by the fact they were alive. Then, the urgent calls began. Report. Sound off. Sanders barked into the interphone, which, miraculously, still worked. One by one, the crew called in. Waist Gunner Sergeant Michael Kosis had a broken arm. Radio Operator Sergeant Joe Pisker had a deep gash on his forehead. But incredibly, no one was dead. Against all odds, they had survived the crash landing. But their ordeal was not over. They were in the middle of a frozen wilderness, in a shattered aircraft that could catch fire at any moment from spilled fuel. And they were not yet sure who would find them first. Helpful Swedish civilians or a German patrol that might ignore neutrality to capture an intact B-17 and its crew. The turning point came not from the air, but from the ground and from a decision made in the moments after the engines fell silent. As smoke and steam rose from the wreck, Captain Sanders knew they had to evacuate immediately. The smell of high-octane fuel was everywhere. Everyone out. Now, he ordered. The crew, battered and bleeding, began scrambling through the hatches and the ruptured fuselage, dragging their wounded comrades with them. They staggered into the deep snow, putting distance between themselves and the potential fireball. The bitter cold of the Arctic, which they had been sealed against in flight, now hit them with full force. They were in summer flying gear, utterly unprepared for a ground survival situation in Lapland in February. Hypothermia would claim them as surely as any German bullet if they did not find shelter. As they huddled together, assessing their situation, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was a Swedish farmer, drawn by the incredible noise of the crash. He approached cautiously, his face a mask of astonishment at the sight of the enormous American warplane lying wrecked in his pasture. He spoke no English. They spoke no Swedish. But through gestures, the universal language of pointing at the aircraft, then at their uniforms, and making a flying motion, understanding dawned. The farmer, whose name was later recorded as Eric Lundstrom, gestured for them to follow him. The heroic decision, made collectively by the exhausted crew under Sanders' leadership, was to trust this stranger. They were armed. They could have tried to hold their position, to wait for official Swedish authorities. but they were freezing, wounded, and exposed. They chose humanity over tactical suspicion. They followed Lundstrom to his modest farmhouse a half-mile away. This act of trust was their salvation. Inside the warm cabin, Lundstrom and his family immediately began to care for them. They provided hot drinks, food, and rudimentary first aid for the wounded. More importantly, Lundstrom sent his son on a bicycle to alert the local authorities in Arvidsjaur. This set in motion the formal process of their internment under Swedish neutrality laws, guaranteeing their safety from the Germans. Within hours, Swedish military and police officials arrived. They secured the site, provided proper medical care, and formally took the American airmen into custody. The unexpected solution, therefore, was not a mechanical fix or a feat of flying, but the simple, compassionate response of a civilian in a neutral country. The field itself had saved their lives, but the farmers' humanity secured their survival. The crew of Delta Rebel No. 2 were now interns, not prisoners of war. They would spend the next months in Swedish internment camps, treated with respect and even camaraderie by their Swedish hosts, a world away from the brutality of a German Stalag Luft. The aircraft itself, a classified piece of American technology, became a point of delicate diplomacy. Swedish authorities, while officially neutral, were keen to examine the advance bomber. American and Swedish officials would engage in a polite but firm diplomatic dance over its fate for weeks to come. But for Sanders and his men, the war was effectively over. They had cheated death through skill, nerve, and an incredible amount of luck, finding sanctuary in the most unlikely of places, a quiet farmer's field at the edge of the Arctic Circle. The resolution of this remarkable story is one of survival and eventual return. All 10 crew members of Delta Rebel No. 2 survived the war. After several months in Swedish internment camps, they were repatriated back to the United States via a complex route that often involved travel through neutral ports. Captain Homer Sanders returned to the United States and continued his service, later participating in the Berlin airlift. The B-17 itself had a more ignominious end. It was too badly damaged to ever fly again. After American officials, wary of letting its secrets be studied too closely, formally requested its disposal, the Swedish military dismantled the wreck on site. Some minor parts were salvaged for study, but the bulk of the airframe was cut apart and scrapped in the very field where it had come to rest. The legacy of the landing at Lake Gusjon is one of legendary airmanship. Captain Sanders was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his extraordinary skill and leadership in saving his crew. The citation specifically highlighted his exceptional judgment and masterful airmanship in executing the wheels-up landing under the most adverse conditions. But the story is also a testament to the randomness of fate in war. A different fighter attack, a cloudier sky over the lake, a farmer less willing to help. Any one of these variables could have turned survival into tragedy. It stands as a powerful example of the individual pilot's role in the vast mechanized war in the air. While strategic bombing campaigns were waged by fleets of aircraft, the lives of 10 men often hinged on the decisions and skills of one person at the controls. The field itself remains a quiet meadow in northern Sweden. There is no grand monument, only local memory and the faint scars in the earth that have long since healed over. The significance of the event lies in its demonstration of human resilience, both in the cockpit and on the ground. It is a story where international boundaries, the laws of neutrality, and simple human kindness intersected with the brutal mechanics of war to produce a rare outcome. A complete, against all odds survival. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII-Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.